Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Alex Hadding, Chief People Officer for Employment Hero, where our mission is to make employment easier and more valuable for everyone. And I'm sure you've all read and heard about what's being called the Great Resignation as we emerge out of the COVID pandemic. But the question is, will it impact our businesses? So to find out, we surveyed 1,000 employees in a number of countries. And what did our insights report tell us? In Australia, we saw that 40% of employees plan to look for a new job in the next 6 months. 15% are already on the hunt for a new role. And a whopping 66% of our younger workers aged between 18 and 24 are also already looking for a job. And what did our research tell us about why people were looking? The top reason was lack of career opportunities at 31%, no pay rise at 30%, and lack of appreciation and recognition at 26%. Last week, I spoke with Kelly Pfeffer and Poncho Riviera Pavan about how to develop rising stars. Today, we're going to talk about how to depart with care. I'm thrilled to introduce our first panelist, the wonderful Shahana, Coach Community Quality Lead at Hello Monday. Shahana's role as career coach enables her to utilise her background and expertise in recruitment, training, and development, as well as leadership, to provide professional career advice and coaching. Shahana enjoys assisting others to achieve their potential and career goals, whilst also encouraging them to discover a deeper self-awareness and growth throughout their journey. She has a key focus on strengthening partnerships with career coaches across Australia and the Asia Pacific to develop a real sense of community, purpose, and shared passion for empowering people in their career development and leadership journeys. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Catherine, owner and managing director at Human Capital Consulting. Catherine recently left the safe harbour of working for some of Australia's leading professional service organisations to establish her own consultancy, Human Capital Consulting. Catherine's vision is to provide uncomplicated advice and solution for her clients' most valued asset, their people. With over 15 years' experience, Catherine possesses a rich set of skills and experiences obtained from the workplace and her personal life, both of which assist in formulating strategies and solutions to achieve best practice outcomes for her clients. Catherine lives by the motto, expect the unexpected when working in HR, but equally, she embraces these complexities and the positive impact that can be made when you do the right thing by people. Shahana and Catherine, welcome to today's panel.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Great. So while onboarding and performance management do get widespread attention from HR, optimizing your offboarding process receives less notice or attention. However, offboarding really is such an essential part of maintaining your company's reputation, improving your current employees' working experience, and preserving networking opportunities. And as we've mentioned, during the pandemic or following the pandemic, many employees are evaluating what they want from their working lives. After the shake-up of this dramatic world event, many are actually embracing the pivot and making a big career move, such as you did, Catherine. And this has triggered what we're calling the Great Resignation, with record numbers of employees resigning from their role. And no workplace is immune. It is extremely likely that we will all see higher levels of resignation over the next 6 months, which is why it's so important to put a plan in place for offboarding. No matter the context on which your employee might leave, there are multiple things to consider. You've got legal requirements. You need to think about the way you communicate it to the rest of the business. And how do you ensure a smooth transition? There's also brand and reputation damage. None of us are immune to negative Glassdoor reviews. In fact, I've had to explain to a number of candidates over the years the reason for negative Glassdoor reviews. And Glassdoor is increasingly becoming a data point for candidates in reviewing potential organisations. So let's talk today about some ways that we would approach involuntary and voluntary turnover as part of the battle that we are all in the war for talent for 2022. I'd like to start with talking about the practicalities of employee departure and offboarding. We all know the offboarding process is a combination of administrative, practical, and communication, making it quite a unique part of the employee life cycle. Catherine, starting with you, for those on the call who may be new to employee departures, could you explain the difference between voluntary and involuntary turnover?
Sure, thanks, Alex. Well, voluntary is probably the more simple and straightforward form of departure that we see, in that the individual has made a decision to leave the organisation, leave their role, their workplace, and this may be for a variety of reasons. The most common one we hear and see is that the individual has obtained employment elsewhere, and therefore they hand in their resignation and serve out their notice period and off they go. There also might be other reasons specific to that individual. You hear of people taking sabbaticals, people like myself who have started their own venture. There may be family, personal reasons. So there can be a variety of reasons that always aren't linked to going to a new employer. Involuntary is often the more complicated aspect of a departure because the person hasn't willingly decided to leave. And this is where it can be complicated for HR professionals and the organisation, because it can often stem from things like a restructure in the organisation, which results in some or many roles becoming redundant. There may be poor performance as a result of a performance improvement plan, which has ended in the termination of the individual, bad behaviour, misconduct, and more serious things that can arise. So they're the difference between the two.
Fantastic, thank you. And then how important, Catherine, is it for a business to have respective plans in place for different types of departures? So for these two different types of people leaving?
Yeah, I think we'll talk about this soon. So I won't go into the aspects of how important it is to communicate something when people are departing, but it would be an interesting and an eyebrow-raising scenario if we applied the same departure comms and farewell process for, say, someone of long-standing tenure who'd had a fantastic career, to this, applied the same approach to somebody who was just investigated and found guilty of, say, really improper conduct. It would be remiss of the organisation to have a farewell saying goodbye to whoever it is for their great tenure and their excellent contribution to the business, and yet we all knew that there was misconduct that had taken place. So the business does need to consider the different ways in which they communicate to ensure that they're reflective of the situation and really are designed to always maintain the dignity and the respect of the individual and the situation at hand.
Yeah, that's great advice. Respecting the individual is so important, but to your point, as is transparency, because if you try to gloss it over, you're just losing the trust of your employees.
That's right.
Over to you, Shahana. Why is offboarding employees correctly so important?
Well, we've been on this journey with thousands of people. And what we have consistently seen is that regardless of the experience and relationship that an employee has with you over the entire duration of your employment, and that could be 5 years to 2 months to 20 years, how you treat them in their final months has a disproportionately large impact on the lasting impression that the employee has of your organization and their time with you. And like you mentioned before, Alex, Glassdoor and online reviews are where we go to first. And we know that a bad review has more of an impact and is more readily shared than good news is. So when we work so hard to build our brand and our reputation in the industry, and we invest so much money into doing this, into our marketing efforts, it's important to remember that the organic messages that are shared from present and past employees is what's really going to influence our brand in the market. So by being conscious of that, we can take a really strong approach in supporting people to transition to their next role. And from that, it could be anything from, like Catherine was saying, there's different scenarios, but being conscious about having integrity with the option you choose for each pathway, and making sure for those who are impacted by a restructure that, you know, you offer things like on-site support, employee assistance, and, you know, those exit interviews, etc., can be really powerful tools to be able to ensure that that transition out of the business is going to leave them with a positive impression of the organization. And those things can be small little gestures, but they go a long way in making the employee feel valued, appreciated, and for everyone in the organization to know how they treat their employees and that they care about their future success.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I especially love the exit interview. I think listening to someone's opinions before they leave is really important, to illustrating to them that you value their input about why they're leaving. So we'll move on to difficult conversations. Regardless of if you need to let an employee go or if they resign, it can create that really uncomfortable conversation and big emotions. And sometimes our managers aren't ready for that. So Shahana, we'll stick with you here. What do you consider best practice when an employee resigns voluntarily?
So that's a really great question, Alex. I believe, and our research at Hudson shows, that good talent goes way beyond just the technical skills and experience. It's cultural fit. It's the IP that they carry with them that really makes them valuable to our businesses. So we want to ensure that when an employee informs us that they wish to leave, that we remain curious and we try to understand those underlying reasons. Catherine mentioned a few earlier. It doesn't have to mean that they're moving to a competitor. There could be so many reasons, a change in lifestyle, etc., or needing to be challenged. So ultimately, if we can ascertain if there's anything that can be done by us to support them to stay on, that would be amazing. So I would say having an approach like what Netflix do, they supposedly have this keeper test. And I think that would be ultimately the best practice. And what they say that they do is Netflix managers are encouraged to consider the question, which of my people, if they told me they were leaving for a similar job at a peer company, would I fight hard to keep at Netflix? And so we have that approach at Hudson as well. And what this does is it allows you it encourages our managers to really take action to ensure that those people, to be questioning who in the organization we need to be looking at, to make sure that they're happy, to ensure that if we would fight hard for them to leave if they wanted to leave, are we looking after them the best that we can now when they're here? Are we looking at their career pathways? Are we ensuring we're paying them correctly? Are they being developed and supported in the way that they need to be?
Yeah, I love that approach. And I think also one of the things we certainly focus on too is there's a really big difference if someone actually hands in a resignation letter. They've made that decision, that mind shift has gone, as opposed to coming to you and saying, oh, Alex, I've had a counter offer. However, I really want to stay at Employment Hero. Could we talk about what could be done to keep me here? Because they've gotten an offer, yet they want to stay, and they haven't actually written that resignation letter, which I think is something to also take into account. And Catherine, I might move over to you. Sadly, HR is quite often the bearer of bad news. We've all been there. What advice do you have for those managers and HR professionals that have to deliver bad news?
Yeah, look, I think don't make it about yourself. Just in my experience, I've been in situations where it may be myself accompanying a manager, and if it were a redundancy conversation, they can often go into the conversation with a mindset, well, this wasn't my decision, this has been a business decision that perhaps I don't agree with, and all of a sudden it changes the direction of the conversation or essentially the emotion that needs to be delivered for that moment. A redundancy conversation in particular, it can be really difficult. Sometimes they are completely out of the blue. Sometimes there are rumblings across the organisation. You hear of things like restructures or a downturn, for example. And my advice to people on this call would be, you've got to remember that in that moment, being told something that, you know, your role is potentially going to be made redundant depending on the legislative framework that sits behind it. Sometimes there's a need to consult, etc. No need to waffle. No need to apologize and say, I'm so sorry, we're in this terrible situation. The reality is the decision has been made or will be made. And at that very moment, a person receiving that information just really needs to digest what they need to hear, because they're going to be processing and they're going to start going off to places that we're not aware of, because we may not have the full understanding of their personal situation. Sometimes financial implications can be quite severe for people. Even though there may be a payout, there may not be. It might be just under, you know, some certain standards for the award or the national employment standards. So keep the information succinct, keep it unemotional, deliver what you need to deliver for that moment, for that person. You can follow up with information around what their alternative options are. Will there be a redeployment period? But remember, there's a lot to take in that moment. If it's to come to, I was just going to say, and then on the flip side, you know, similarly, the termination from perhaps poor performance, I find them to be really difficult, because often the person has tried to breach the gap of poor performance and they've got all the great behavioural characteristics, but technically they can't perform the role. Often that's because, you know, things have changed dramatically in the organisation and their capability and competency hasn't kept up. And again, I would encourage people not to make it about them, the deliverer of the news, saying, you know, it's terrible, we're in this situation, we feel so sad, you know, we wish we could have done more. Or again, you've just got to get cut to the chase invariably and just say, you know, we've gone through this process, and keep it direct, keep it really clear for the person to understand, because where we let ambiguity fill the void and we waffle, it just creates more uncertainty for the individual.
Absolutely. Such great advice. And it can quite often help to have a script and even say to the employee, look, I'm a bit nervous, so I'm going to speak from a script. But I'd love to highlight a couple of the things that Catherine said there. And that was to treat people like humans and with care. And going back to Patty McCord, who wrote a book called Powerful, and she was the original person heading up people and culture at Netflix. She also talks about treating people like adults. So there's a famous story of her when they first decided to start streaming, and she knew the developers weren't up to scratch. So she literally pulled them into a room and said, unfortunately, we're going to have to figure out how to upgrade you and upskill you, or we're going to have to make the tough decision to replace you, because we're about to move really fast on streaming. And she just had that adult conversation with them. So, you know, adults are adults and they can understand it. And then your other point, Catherine, about underperformers, one of the really big points that is often not discussed or is avoided is don't hold on to an underperformer, because you damage the morale of the existing team so much. If they're all working so hard and exceeding expectations and you've got someone not meeting expectations, it can be super damaging to your existing team.
And I just an additional point, just really quickly on that, I often have observed managers who, for fear of, you know, thinking about themselves, like, how does this reflect on me? Not making that decision to highlight your point there, Alex. I agree. It just festers beyond, you know, what's necessary. And actually, more often than not, the person is often relieved that you've had that conversation with them. They're thinking, thank goodness, I'm so grateful it's been called out. Now I can move on too.
Yes, that's a great point. I'll move this question over to both of you. What advice or key takeaways do you have for those who are still struggling with potential conflict or difficult conversations?
I wholeheartedly agree with what you both just mentioned before about the communication. You know, we all can take good news really well, and I think we're incredibly surprised by how well humans can be resilient to bad news. But it's that clarity that's so freeing. So it's just being, I think, changing our mindset about delivering that bad news and thinking, you know, how can we state what needs to be stated and then help them with moving forward? So what can our role be to support them as they move forward, and remaining curious. I love that concept of the map is not the territory. Have you heard of that? Where, you know, it's our perception of the world and how we experience things is filtered through our values, our memories of our memories, our religious beliefs, etc. So our filters shape so much of what we see and experience. And that's why we can be in the exact same room as multiple people, and we'll have a different experience of the exact same thing. So when we can stay compassionate and empathetic and remain curious with whoever's in front of us, it can allow us to break through some of those filters and be able to support them in a way that's truly authentic. And that can then remind us that, that we're people.
And I think just to add on to that, even though it might feel like you are scripted because you need to be, no one appreciates going off piece when you're delivering such a difficult news. Don't forget about the aftercare aspect. There is nothing preventing you the following day or that night from calling up the team member or grabbing them in the hallway, or if you see them on their way out for work, and just asking, look, I appreciate today was really difficult. Are you okay? We'll be able to work through this, and also provide some moral support in the sense that, you do have, especially if it was a redundancy or, even poor performance, everybody has quality traits, technical skills, and they can be utilized. Perhaps they were just a square peg in a round hole for that position, but they will flourish in another organization or in another position that's better suited to their needs. So I think we also need to remember that we don't kick people out on the curb. It's about that ongoing and that particularly that transition out of the business, that at least they leave the organization, even though it wasn't how they hoped it would end up. They've got the confidence intact to go and have another successful role elsewhere.
I love it. And I find scripting the conversation can be really helpful, and then giving that script to the employee so they can reread it when they go home. And back to both of your points, a square peg in a round hole. It might be that they've joined a startup such as ours, super fast moving, and you actually say to them, look, you'll be super successful if you move to a huge corporate that's very process driven, where there are lots of approvals and processes that are documented, and that's what you need to focus on. So helping them to move forward is so important. Let's move on to how to communicate when someone leaves. It can be really hard to know what to do. Do you publicly announce it on email? How do you actually kind of tackle it? So, Catherine, what do you recommend businesses should do to communicate about someone leaving?
Yeah, and look, again, different situations will have, I suppose, different levels of hoopla that go with it. But my number one rule is you must communicate something, irrespective of the situation. I have seen and witnessed examples where perhaps there has been an individual that has been let go, or they've left abruptly, and the choice was just to not say anything. Now, what does that immediately do? It creates a black hole of information, and people fill it with their own narrative. And that own narrative turns into rumors and misinformation. And that misinformation is so damaging, not only for the departing employee, but also the team, the organization. So we need to communicate, and it can be as simple as, particularly if the situation has been a sour one, just to call it out, to say, so-and-so, as of today, no longer works for the organization. We wish them all the very best. Arrangements will be made to replace that individual. Just something. People are intelligent. They'll figure out over time what the situation was, even without knowing it. But don't allow employees internally to speculate. It's one of the worst things I think we as leaders can allow to happen. And of course, if there are other situations where we know there's a long-standing employee who's retired, often you can have a really beautiful moment where they've contributed so much to an organization and almost been revered as a mentor or a grandfather or grandmother figure. I've seen a few of those in my time, where you have a beautiful announcement at the staff meeting, and people are touched and they realize, so there's all different ways, but please communicate something.
Yep, agree entirely. And to your point, transparency creates trust. And even if it's short and sweet, you're still respecting the person, but people they'll read between the lines. Thank you. And Shahana, when an employee does leave, their role opens up and someone else from the business could potentially step in. So when and how should businesses engage existing staff about potential progression opportunities?
That's another great question, Alex. I don't think there's one simple approach to this. And my answer would be that ideally, you've prepared for this in advance by doing succession planning effectively and just having it always at top of mind. So by doing this, you probably would have identified successes before learning the news of this person wanting to leave. And in that case, we'd recommend running a closed process first if the policy allows. This allows people to understand and feel acknowledged about, them being valued as part of the business internally and all that IP and culture being important too. And then next best is to run an internal process to allow people fair access to apply. So it's, broadening out the net a little bit further, still internally, but with applications. It's important to know that, the worst thing we can do is run a process just for the sake of it. If we don't feel like we have, because we've done the succession planning, we haven't been able to identify someone that's the right fit for the role. Again, that integrity and transparency is key here. So just letting us know that we're going out to market to find someone because of this skill set, etc., that we really want to pinpoint the right person for the role. Amazing. And as recommended earlier, I think that communication piece, we've all mentioned it so many times, but just making sure that everyone knows where they stand and we keep that communication period open. Because if we do that, what Catherine was saying, we have those people who are retiring. There's just people in between as well who just want to try out and see if the grass is greener on the other side. And if we can respect them and treat them professionally and show them how much we appreciate them, that boomerang effect it's possible. And I know when I was choosing Hudson back in the day, almost 10 years ago, I was looking at who left, what was the retention rate, who came back, and seeing that boomerang effect gave me hope and comfort that they must be doing something well if people are coming back.
Yeah, and they bring new skills when they do come back.
Exactly, yeah. So I think that shows the people who are left behind another story about the culture too, and it's really important.
Absolutely. And Shahana, just sticking on your point of succession planning, what if there's only one person who could step into the role? Do you recommend tapping them on the shoulder and just promoting them, or still having that open process?
Well, that would be the closed process that I mentioned earlier. So if the organization is really clear on their communication around succession planning, identifying growth pathways, and working with their leaders to develop skills in order to get to that next role, it's almost like everything's on the table. And so those people are actually anticipating that this is going to be the next step for them because they've been working so hard towards it, and everyone in the business is aware of their part that they're on. So that can be a really easy and fluid approach that happens.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's move on to exit interviews. Let's explore them, why to do them, and what to ask. Sticking with you, Shahana, they're often overlooked. So why are they worth doing?
I am a huge believer in continuous improvement, and I believe that the exit interviews provide you with absolute gold dust when it comes to understanding if your strategies on, employee engagement or training and development, leadership, operations, whether any of that is actually working and if it's having the impact that you want it to. What I've heard from people who have not been provided with the opportunity to share their thoughts and experiences through an exit interview is that they feel unheard. And that the organization, regardless of what they say their values and their culture is, they're just actually not interested in getting feedback. That's true. So it makes them feel like the company's inauthentic. So if you can be really conscious about aligning the questions you ask in those exit interviews to be able to capture data around engagement, your staff retention, the policies, what's really going on in the business, it's a great opportunity for you to check in to see if it's working, and then be able to create continuous improvement strategies to evolve as a business to hit the targets you want to.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Catherine, what sorts of questions can a business ask in an exit interview to get the most insight from a departing employee?
Yeah, I mean, you can go be quite extensive and expansive in your remit of what you ask people. They may choose not to ask. There are also different ways in which you can conduct the exit interview, which may elicit different responses. I've seen, certain organisations, because of their size, they just use an internal person to go through that process. I've seen organisations where they outsource it to consultancies that actually do this on their behalf. But in terms of the questions that I think are really valuable, I just wanted to make one point before we go into that, is around, and I think this has been brought up already, how important it is to ask these questions in the now as well, particularly when it comes to manager feedback and the role and how it's constructed. That stuff often can be the reason why someone has left. They're overworked, the resources aren't distributed fairly, the manager's got some issues that they need to work with, or there's some tension there. Someone who's got good leadership qualities will actually actively seek out that feedback on a regular basis and work with their team to tweak, refine, improve. Sometimes the exit interview, it's too little too late, and the reason that they left could have been solved and addressed in the moment. Holistically speaking, I agree with Shahana that there's a lot of gold dust that you can extract from exit interviews regarding culture, values, policies, manager feedback, also really intricate questions around bullying, improper conduct. Have they observed any of this? Sometimes not everybody speaks up. We're well aware of that in the media of late, that there's often this fear of retribution. One of my favorite questions is always understanding, how would you describe this organization to a friend? Would you recommend it to a peer in another organization? So really trying to find out those innate feelings that people have. But a word of caution too, exit interviews can be tainted at times depending on the experience of the departing employee. So you do need to have that lens to distinguish what's tainted, what's accurate. And that's why I think it's very important that we spend time in the now getting that feedback from our people that we work alongside, being brave and courageous to ask those questions, because sometimes it is like lifting up the mirror and hearing things that you maybe don't want to hear.
And sticking on that point, you made a really good point about a little too late, and you might receive negative feedback about that person's manager. How would you approach that difficult conversation with the manager that's going to stay, and talking to them about where they need to improve, I guess, to make sure they don't continue to lose employees?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because there's that consent piece. Some people, speak in strictly confidence with either the individual, the HR personnel, person on the ground, or the external consultancies. You have to be mindful about how much you divulge, because it can, again, if it falls into the wrong hands, it can become a contentious matter. And I have heard of situations where a departing employee has had negative feedback on their manager. The manager catches wind of this, and then they mention something in passing the next time they see that person. So, you need to be mindful of that. So what I've preferred to do, and what I've seen that works well in the past, is getting the consent, making sure they feel comfortable that it's going to be shared in a manner that's usually thematic, so themes, and not directly, quote unquote, this is what so-and-so said about you. So let's highlight themes that often are grouped across the organisation. It might be, feedback was really poor, or resourcing was managed poorly, or they micromanage. You might see that theme come up in a number of exit interviews, which the organisation can then address as a whole without specifically targeting an individual.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. A really good idea is to theme things up, and especially if you see a bit of a spike in attrition, you can kind of say we've, seen a spike in attrition, and here are the main themes around why people are leaving. So let's put an action plan together to address it.
Can I also add to that, that 360-degree feedbacks, or 180-degree feedbacks during appraisal time, or quarterly or 6 monthly, can really help with having other data that you can then compare that feedback to, the exit interview feedback to, and see if there's themes as well, or if there's consistency, or if it's completely abnormal. And if you get most people when they are doing their exit interview, if you ask them for permission to be able to explore this further, just in case anyone else is impacted by this experience as well, and that because most of the time we wish we had known earlier so we could have done something about it. So just having that conversation, again, like you said, being courageous to ask can allow us to think of it as being a remedial action that we can take and look into.
Fantastic. Thank you both. So let's talk about employee departures in our new remote world of work, or quite often hybrid world of work. So to both of you, remote work has really changed the world at work as we know it. So how has this impacted employee departure, and what do those on the call need to be mindful of?
I might just start off, I think early days in the pandemic, a lot of organisations were faced with this reality of a downturn, or an expected downturn in economic activity. And so there was some knee-jerk reactions around restructuring and certainly reducing headcount numbers. And one of the things that I experienced was this hesitation around talking to people about, you know, the fact that their role was being looked at as being redundant, and doing this virtually was so uncomfortable for people. It was, and as a result, there was this hesitation, this delay. No, we can't do that. We kept waiting for lockdowns to end in order to have the conversation face to face. And again, that's anxiety inducing when people are aware that there is a huge unfolding situation that no one has control over. And so just really, as the HR person, you know, advising and influencing the stakeholders, was to really get them to see that the longer that we delay this, that the harder this is going to be for the organisation, because it had already filtered through the business that there was going to be changes. But you can still have a very productive, respectful conversation virtually. And I know we're all accustomed to it now. But I hope that we all just treat this as our second skin. You can have any type of conversation virtually now, because it's not so much, yes, there's the ability to be in the moment with someone physically, but you can still impart empathy, kindness, care in a virtual sense. So just take the same approach that you would in a face-to-face setting and do it virtually.
Amazing.
I'm not sure I understand.
I agree. I think that it's really easily, moving on from those discussions to just in our normal workplace, just carrying on with work. I feel like it's easy to feel isolated and left behind sometimes. And so it really calls on our leaders to be more mindful in engaging with team members, and, you know, making the time to not do a phone call, but rather do a virtual meeting where you can have the video on. In all your meetings, try and keep those videos on. And because I'm a massive Brené Brown fan. So, I believe when she says we're wholeheartedly, we're hardwired for connection. And so if we can keep those lines of communication open and try and use the technology that we have at our disposal as best as possible, we can reduce the negative impacts of working in this remote world. I think that was important to say. And like you mentioned before, it's communicating. So you just have to be really mindful of the active listening and apply that on the virtual call.
Such great advice. And I think if you can follow up with your team immediately afterwards as well, and have a team meeting without the departing employee, just to check in with them. Do they have any questions about why Alex is leaving, where she's going, any reasons around that? And you can do that virtually as well, as long as it's face-to-face or on camera. So let's move on to Q&A. So John is the first to ask a question today, and he's asked, some staff quit and do not serve their notice period. What are employer options at that point? I haven't been able to find any penalties or consequences other than no pay.
Yeah, that's in terms of the legal. If someone just walks out and doesn't serve their notice period, then that's right. The employer doesn't need to honour their pay. But obviously, it comes back down to, well, if there was an abrupt departure and the team's left in the lurch, there's a significant resource missing. And sometimes, and this is really unfortunate, you may not be able to connect or communicate in with that departed employee. They actually have been in situations where they go MIA. They turn their phone off, they're not contactable, and that's awkward because you actually really don't know what to say to team members or how to fill the void. So again, if after repeated times you are unable to make contact with them, again, it's that very simple line of communication that, Jeff will not be returning, and we'll do our best to fill the void that he's left, and we'll talk about resourcing and tasks, etc., that need to be fulfilled.
Great advice. Thank you. Next is Miriam. How much weight does a restraint clause carry on termination if the employee is shifting to a competitor? This is a really interesting one, Miriam, and it can go either way, but you have every right to go to Fair Work and make a case or to a lawyer that the employee is going to a competitor and that they are actually that they're going against that restraint clause. And really recently, as of only a few months ago, it was actually implemented within or between two companies, and the person had to step down from their role and they were allowed to go back in 9 months. I don't know if either of you have anything to add to that.
No, except we haven't really covered this today, gardening leave and competitor and restraints. And again, I've witnessed incredibly harsh restraints that actually put a wedge between the employer and the departing employee. So I think, again, embracing a mindset of reasonableness really, and this is when it comes back to what I said before, is it about you or is it about them? And often it's the employer digging their heels in and saying, nah, they've left us in the lurch. I'm not gonna let them go. And it's kind of like, wow, what kind of message are we sending? Yes, there are rules in place contractually, but is there an opportunity to converse, to talk, to negotiate? Again, everything should be on the table. Otherwise, you do get quite a tense 6 months from that person.
I love that advice, and I couldn't agree more. We've actually had a couple of people recently go to competitors or people within our industry. We could have absolutely, exercised our right to that clause. However, we didn't want that person to be unemployed. We knew they wanted to leave. We wanted to leave on good terms. So we had that candid conversation of, please realize there is this clause, and so we are just sending you a reminder letter to let you know that you do have to keep confidential information confidential, etc. And then they're still having a good experience, which I think is good. The next question: any advice for how to handle when an employee resigns and wants to leave immediately, despite no prior incidents or bad blood?
I think if I could take that one, I would say trying to keep the lines of the communication open and stay curious. And, Michael Bungay-Steiner uses that saying, the 3 steps is asking, what's the real issue here? What else? What else? And what else? So really trying to create a safe space so you can understand what's going on, because there must be something that's under the surface. And if we can capture what that is, then we have the opportunity to influence an outcome. And that could be to support them with being able to stay on. We never know what's happening in their private lives, or, what could be instigating, what fear they might be working from, or what assumptions they've made. So if we can create that safe space for them to share, it just puts you in a position to be able to support them and prevent others from having the same experience as well.
Yes, people talk. And the next one is from Anne or Anne. How about when employee involved is near the retirement age and simply no longer able to bridge the technical gap?
Yeah. I've seen this unfold in a couple of organisations I've worked in, and there's, again, a place for these individuals, but often you have to start with that open conversation, being upfront with them, and again, that competency level from a technology perspective is often one that can harbour and cause problems. But again, I've seen this also play out really positively, where the individual actually has embraced the conversation because it's allowed them to go part-time and start to transition into retirement life. B, they serve a different purpose in the organisation. Often it's a mentorship role, a business development role, getting involved in other projects that rely upon their amazing suite of IP and knowledge and organisational wisdom that they've got. So there is a place for them. But, again, nobody wants to be told there's no place for them and not be given a reason. So let's just be super upfront and then help transition with them and make it an enjoyable journey to retirement.
Yeah, that's great advice. And also open-ended questions. Alex, how do you think you're doing in your role? And they might open up and say, look, I'm actually not coping with the speed at which we're moving, or the speed at which technology is changing. And then you can open that really constructive conversation. And moving back to Anne again, where do you draw the line with being a good corporate citizen?
With respect to?
Probably the way you treat someone, or maybe how long you keep them on for if they're not performing.
I think I might have mentioned this earlier on, Shahana. I don't know if you've got any views about that. Feeling obligated, and maybe that not wanting to upset the apple cart, not wanting to do the wrong thing by this person. Again, I've seen a variety of situations. One I'm familiar with the person had some really intense personal stuff going on, and telling them that their performance, just wasn't cutting it, just was so traumatizing for the manager. They just couldn't get there because they were so concerned about the impact it would have on this other thing going on in their life. But again, through patience and encouragement, our role is to help them see that that the outcome overall will be better, and you can do it in a way that assists in managing their personal and their work life. Because like I said, sometimes that strain of knowing that you're not performing and not being told and just trying to do your best can be more damaging than just being told and then working with them to whether it's move on or try something different in the business.
Amazing.
And I think if I add to that, what we walk past, we're actually endorsing. So we might feel like we're saving that person, but the impact that it's having on everyone around them is you're creating a culture, or you're allowing a culture that may not be in line with what you genuinely want for your team. And it can result in lowering discretionary effort from the rest of the team. It could result in them copying those behaviors because, they're allowed to do it, so why can't we? And it can really create a toxic environment. So I feel like, if you can have that courageous conversation, and from the very beginning, I think all of these things that we're talking about start a lot earlier, when you're setting expectations, holding people accountable, having feedback regularly, making feedback part of the culture, so people know that it's transparent, it's open, they expect it, and it's a feedback nurturing environment. You can prevent a lot of these other things from happening.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Miriam is asking, is it negative to only do exit interviews on specific staff, for example, staff that are valued or probably higher performers, rather than just doing an exit interview for every single person leaving the business?
I think it should be standard across everyone. Would you agree, Catherine?
Yeah, I was just to say, even people say, oh goodness, should we offer it to someone whose role was made redundant? I say yes, absolutely. They've got views, they didn't choose to leave. You may find it a bit tricky if someone has been found guilty of some really like I said, improper conduct that it just wouldn't be suitable to sit there and engage and reflect on their time and ask for their improvements. I think you've got to again look at the situation and maybe deal with that quite sensitively.
Absolutely. And Miriam, I'd add to that, you might think an exit interview with an underperformer or someone on a PIP is not worthwhile. However, you want to delve into it. Did we not provide you with enough support? Did we not ramp you up enough? Was there a reason that you didn't perform, so that you can delve into that not happening again? Because we have to keep in mind so much effort goes into recruiting and onboarding employees. Losing them, you need to figure out why you're losing them, or perhaps why they're underperforming. Moving on to Bianca, what's the best way to keep the messaging positive and acknowledge departures when we have heaps of resignations because of the current market? Oh, it's a great one.
Look, I think it depends, the volume of resignations that you're experiencing, because it can be really unsettling for other people that might be observing this kind of steady stream of people leaving. I think it actually goes beyond the broad communication. I think it's then really relying upon the managers to step up and to talk about it. Have a team meeting, call it out, say, there's been 4 people from the marketing department that have resigned over the last 2 months. We acknowledge that this is can be really unsettling for us in our roles, because we partner with this team and we rely upon them. So, are there any concerns in this team? Have one-on-ones with people talking about the changes in the business. What, concerns do they have? Again, often it's that people start to fill the void if they don't know the full story. And even though we can't disclose everything, a manager can certainly provide reassurance and some comfort to their immediate team to keep them stable through what might be quite a disruptive time, because not everybody is going to resign in this great resignation. And there are a lot of people who enjoy and love their jobs and haven't even thought about leaving. So we've got to get around those people as well. And where we do see a red flag, maybe, we've been talking about this the whole time, get in quicker, talk about it, see if there's any way from preventing them from leaving if they're genuinely considering it.
Yeah, that's great. And I'd also add that transparency piece, call it out. We've recently seen a bit of a spike in attrition or people resigning. So we're going to do a quick employee survey to try and get to the bottom of it. And then you might see some themes, read out and come up with some action plans, which is super important. And also, again, going back to that piece, if someone resigns, is there someone internally that you can promote, even if they're not yet quite ready for that role? Because then you're showing career development, which is one of the reasons that our surveys show that people are leaving. So you're showing that internally you're looking at moving people up and promoting them rather than just going external every time someone leaves. And the next question is from Sam. What if the person says they can't come to work to serve out their notice because they're affected by their mental well-being after being told that they're no longer being able to be employed?
Again, have seen this play out and am very, very supportive of supporting them. Remember, we've all got different thresholds. We've all got different abilities. It can be embarrassing. People can feel ashamed. Others just waltz in and own it, and they're fine with it. They think it's great. They're getting a payout and off they go. So there is so many differing levels of reaction. And if a person is genuinely affected because it's either been through a role that's been made redundant or a performance issue, I would encourage them, to get back into the office and assure them that people aren't going to be talking about them because we've, got a workplace that's, centralized on respect. But, again, case by case will determine. You don't want to put the person, sink them into a hole where they can't bounce back and find another opportunity for themselves. We definitely want to help with that transition. And it might be that you come to an agreement where it's a couple of days or 3 or 4 days a week where they're at home. I think some interaction with the workplace is important though.
Absolutely. And, great advice. It comes back to treating people like humans, and mental health is real. We can't have stigma around it. If someone is suffering, let them move on. You'll fill the void, and then you're treating them really well, and they're going to have had a good experience with leaving your company, or at least have a good thought about your company. Moving on to...
So I was just going to say, leveraging services like EAP and ensuring that they not only know that they have access to it, but removing the stigma against using it. So when I do my career coaching, I always mention that it's almost like thinking about EAP like a dentist. You don't want to wait till you have to go and get the root canal. You want to go and see them on a regular basis. You want to learn the tools and techniques to look after yourself so that you can manage those difficult times and build your resilience and sustainable resilience. And I've coached people who, like when we talk about redundancies, I don't know if there's a right way. I've seen people who have found out on the day. I've been there to do the conversation post the exit interview, and the conversation where they've found out their role's been impacted and they've left the business, and that's been it, handing them everything. And then I've worked with people who have 3 months to 6 months or 1 month of working post the conversation. And I don't know if there's one way or another that's easier. I think it's just about how we support them through that. So whether it's, their career transition coach that works them through how to have the conversations, how to engage in their work and make it meaningful. And I think the really important thing is making sure that they feel that work is meaningful. Because if they just feel like they're there to be a bum on a seat and they have no purpose, they don't feel like they're adding value, it's really hard to get out of bed and come to work to do that. So if you can ensure that you communicate that, and with the broader team, with all this communication we're talking about, it can make it feel much more safer and allow them to feel comfortable and confident to wrap up properly.
Yeah, that's amazing advice. And John is asking, how do you measure staff retention? By splitting voluntary and involuntary, or lump it all together in one number?
Again, just going off previous workplaces, we have lumped it all in together, but we've had the ability to slice and dice and to really break down data. So, and it can be contentious because some people argue, well, 20 redundant roles in a calendar, in the year that you're looking at doesn't paint the right picture because people haven't willingly chosen to leave. So that's my view.
Yeah, and my view is to track it, have your one number, which is all of it lumped together, but then do a regret and a non-regret. So a regret is obviously a high performer who has resigned, and a non-regret could be someone who was on a PIP and they've left, or someone who's been made redundant. And that way you're looking at the real figure is the regretted attrition. Now, we do have a number of questions still pending, but I'm not sure how you are for time. I'd love to, from Shana and Catherine, I'd love to get from you before we tie up, if there was one thing you could tell those on the call to consider about employee offboarding or departure, what's that piece of nugget or advice that you would give?
We spend a lot of time bringing people into the organisation. We spend time writing up the job advertisement, just getting the right comms. We invest time in interviews and touch points, all to bring them and make them feel good when they come into an organisation. The same can be applied when someone is exiting an organisation. Don't throw a script together last minute that you haven't thought through. Give it some time and space so it sounds good, in the sense that it's empathetic and it's got the right tone. Have the right touch points. Recruit in a couple of people that the person is close to in the organisation. They are great advocates for checking in and just being the soft, landing port for that person. So it can reflect and mirror how we bring people in as how we want to send them out, and don't set and forget and think, because often we go, oh, okay, well, it's an inconvenience on me in the organisation. I need to backfill that person now. That's just all I can think about because I've got deliverables to achieve. So let's change our view on that.
Love it.
I 100% mirror that. And I think the key thing, a simple way of remembering it would be to treat people the way you wish to be treated. And that's from the very beginning when we bring them on board. And, like Catherine was just saying, all the respect and the effort and energy we put into that onboarding process of recruiting them. And just imagine the kind of world we would live in if we did that same energy and effort and passion as we were helping people to transit out for whatever reason it is. Good, bad, ugly. And if we remember that it's people, we expect it to be messy and complicated as well. And so we go in with a mindset of, how can we just be what that person needs us to be in this time, to allow everyone that's left in the organization even to know that what our brand is honest and true and authentic.
Love it. And also, just for those on the call today, we have mentioned a couple of really great authors, and they're very relevant topics around candid, radical candor and tough conversations. And that was Patty McCord from Netflix, and her book is called Powerful. And then Brené Brown has a number of books. She also has some fantastic podcasts, and they all touch on just being completely honest and having authentic conversations, psychological safety and trust. And the third I'd recommend is Kim Scott, who's written a book called Radical Candor, and she just talks about how to introduce that into your organizations. So Catherine and Shahana, thank you so much for your time today. If our audience would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way to contact you?
LinkedIn.
Yeah, I would say the same. I'm just about to finalize my website, but I'm easily findable on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. I'm happy to stay on to answer a couple of the other questions, or Jules, is it best if we kind of send out a blog, just given, I think there seem to be a few people dropping off, so I'm sure people are off to appointments. So we can answer those pending questions for you as a follow-up. But thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next series next week. Have a fantastic day, and for those in Sydney, enjoy the nice weather that we have finally gotten. And thanks again so much, Catherine and Shahana. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you,
Alex.
Bye.